It's Friday, August 15th, and Erin has officially strengthened into a weak hurricane. And with all of this deep convection at the center, we are really about to see Erin get its act together as it marches towards major hurricane status. And yes, Erin still is expected to become a major hurricane at the earliest now by potentially Sunday afternoon. And a lot of the models are potentially pointing at a category 4 solution. Now, the track really hasn't moved that much since yesterday. It's still really pointing at anywhere between the Carolinas and Bermuda as the most probable outcome. But from right now through the weekend is going to be the most critical phase for finding out where Erin is actually going to go. And on our ensembles, they're still pointing on that track going in between the Carolinas and Bermuda as the most probable outcome. However, it is still important to remember that this storm is a little under a week out from potentially making any land impacts, so I would actually still be pretty weather aware up here in the Carolinas. And one other thing that I do want to point out is that our ensembles are actually indicating some development out here in the Gulf heading towards the far southern tip of Texas of potentially a tropical depression. And if you're keeping up with the National Hurricane Center's page, you may have noticed that as well. They've actually highlighted a 50% chance of formation for that same area indicated in the ensembles. And there is actually a pretty decent chance of seeing a tropical depression form and head into the far southern tip of Texas. Now, this wouldn't really bring any big impacts like surge or wind gust, but it would likely bring quite a bit of wind and potentially a flooding threat to that area. And then on top of our tropical weather, we once again have a severe weather threat today, specifically up here in the northern plains and far northern Midwest, with a focus on central Wisconsin. We actually have a slight risk in that area, then a marginal risk, which spans quite a bit further west all the way into the upper plains. And our slight risk area is going to be fueled by potentially some strong gusty winds in that 65-mile-an-hour range. And there's just a conditional threat of some 60-mile-an-hour gust in the rest of our marginal risk area. And then our hail threat is going to be pretty much identical in the shape. However, it's going to be a bit skinnier, and the threat for hail would be in that 1 to 1.5 inch range out here in central Wisconsin today. And then just the conditional threat of some 1 inch hail in the rest of our marginal risk area. And then there is also the conditional for a couple of weak spin up tornadoes out in our main risk area today, specifically or closer to that slight risk area. And these would mostly just be weak and spin ups along a line of thunderstorms. And then for our flash flooding risk today, it's actually going to be quite sparse and also spread out at the same time. We have one up here in our main risk area with that severe weather, potentially for the risk of 2 to 4 inches of rain in the slight risk area. The same thing for rain levels in western North Carolina, and then far southern Texas, and also far southeastern Arizona. And then in all of our marginal risk areas, one out here in the Pacific Northwest, another one extending a bit further out in our northern Midwest to Great Lakes region area, then along the Atlantic coast, which ends in the mid-Atlantic, also in the Gulf Coast, and also in the desert Southwest. There will be the threat of 1 to 2 inches of rain in all of those. And then a new heat dome is officially building over the far southeast lower Mississippi River Valley and even into the Great Plains. We could expect to see quite a lot of some very warm temperatures, specifically in that mid 100s feels like range today in pretty much this entire region, unfortunately. Now, in the earlier hours, specifically around midday, this risk of seeing some super warm temperatures with our heat dome is going to be a bit more eastward. And then as we go further into the afternoon, that's when we're really going to see that big warm up in the central plains, pretty much the entire Great Plains, except the very tippity top of the northern plains is going to be experiencing that extreme heat. And here's what the radar could look like later today in our main risk area. We can see that one of the reasons why our risk of severe weather is so conditional today is because our models actually aren't really picking up that much development. Now, if there were to be big severe weather like they are expecting, it would likely be a bit more of a very large MCV along a front, potentially a embedded low pressure system, then also a shortwave ejecting, but it's really only seeing some pretty isolated supercell development right now. Now, this would still bring the threat of some large hail in that 1 to 2 inch range, and also some isolated damaging gusts, potentially in that 65 to 70 mile an hour range. But if we were to see quite a bit more widespread severe weather, it would likely be a bit more of a larger line of thunderstorms. And then these would be expected to initiate around the late afternoon today and then last through the early night hours. And here's a look from the rest of our risk area, likely only bringing that conditional threat for some hail and some gusty winds. Now we're going to see that I think our greatest chance of seeing some severe weather is actually going to be back here closer to the upper plains. And this would also be helped by a front, then also that troughing activity, and also potentially a embedded low pressure system, then also just the natural weak dry line created by where the plains and the Rockies meet. Now, there also is the conditional threat of seeing some thunderstorms a bit later in the night along this boundary, but that is going to be quite a bit more conditional, and I'd probably say there's a smaller chance of that happening, but definitely I do think we will see some strong storms, potentially severe, back further near the upper plains today. And these are 500 millibar winds showing where our large scale forcing is going to be today. And we're going to look for a couple of things. One is going to be a shortwave ejecting out here in our main site risk area. And that would likely happen around the late afternoon. That is why there is still the conditional threat of a couple of strong, severe storms and potentially even a strong line. But what's really going to be hindering a lot of this synoptically is going to be this large area of flow over our main risk area, which actually hinders lift out here by quite a bit. Then we're also going to be looking for a kink back in our upper plains risk area. And we actually are going to see that we do get it, although it's going to be a bit weaker. We're going to see a lot of northwesterly flow come in, and also potentially a embedded low pressure system a bit near the late afternoon and early night hours today, definitely helping to initiate those storms out there. And also a large ridge digging in pretty much all the way across the lower Mississippi River Valley, southeast, and even southern plains, which is also going to help to bring some organizing shear to our storms up here. Then also that extreme heat dome building in over this region as well. And here's the storm environment from our site risk area today, which could bring that threat of all hazards of severe weather, depending on if we do get widespread severe storms today. And immediately we're going to see one of the culprits for why that might not actually happen. We're going to see some pretty stable air in the first 3 kilometers of the atmosphere with not really high lapse rates at all. So that's one of the reasons why storms might really struggle to get going today. But nonetheless, we will have a conditionally very favorable atmosphere. We're actually going to have a pretty nice curve and then elongation in our photograph, and then some nice low-level helicity and low-level shear, definitely supportive of a weak spin-up tornado threat potentially in our site risk area today. And that's going to be coupled with a low enough cloud base for that to also happen. Then we also have a nice bit of organizing shear in that 35 knot range. So definitely some organized storms, and that's also going to be coupled with some wind veering, helping to achieve the same thing. Other things are going to be a very moist environment, 74 dew point with a pretty unstable environment as well, 4,000 cape. So just favorable for severe weather today. And then also our 3 cape is going to be nearing 150. So not only favorable for severe weather, but also making our environment a bit more favorable for tornadoes. Now, another thing that I do want to point out is that we do have some dry air loft and also a extremely high precipitable water. Now, both these things will help to potentially increase the strength of downdrafts and also some strong damaging gust. Our precipitable water being super high, around 2 inches, actually is going to be one of the reasons for that large flooding threat out here today in our site risk area. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention is the risk potentially of seeing some hail. We do have quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level, and we also have some nice mid-level lapse rates, 8.1 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. If we saw that big linear line of storms, I do think the threat would really be for 1 to 1.5 inch hail. But if we do get some more isolated discrete modes like the ARRR is currently predicting, I do think we could potentially see some larger hail in that 2-inch range today as well. And then further out west in the rest of our plains and also upper plains risk area for severe weather today, we're going to see a very favorable environment for severe weather, actually a very moist environment, 70 dew point, and a extremely unstable environment, 5,000 cape. Then our 3 cape actually isn't going to be too bad for this region at about 57. Normally it would be lower. So all things that would be favorable for severe weather today. Our precipitable water is actually going to be pretty high as well, around 1.83 inches. So potentially a flooding threat evolving out here. Then that's also going to help with some strong downdrafts. Also with the dry air aloft that's going to be present. Other things are going to be a pretty low relative humidity nearing 50%. Then also a pretty high downdraft cape around 1,500. Other things that we're going to look for are going to be a pretty solid amount of organizing shear, also around that 35-knot range. That's going to be coupled with some wind veering. So organized storms are definitely going to be in play. Then we also have a decent bit of curvature in our photographs, and then also our low level listing and low level shear isn't going to be terrible either. Then coupled with our extremely high low level lapse rates, and then a decent bit of 3 cape and just generally extremely high instability, we could potentially see a threat for a couple of weak tornadoes as well. Now, that would be pending on if these storms could get a tad bit more surface based, which I definitely think they could the closer to that boundary they're going to be. In this weather sounding, it's depicting that our cloud base would be a bit too high, but it's not so high that that threat would be totally out of play. But I do think the main threat is going to be some potentially decently sized hail. Now, some of that threat for that hail is going to be fueled by quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level. Then our mid-level lapse rates are also going to be pretty high at nearing 9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. So the main threats are going to be some hail in that 1 to 2 inch in diameter range, and then some strong damaging gusts in that 60 to 70 mile an hour range. And I also wouldn't rule out the threat for potentially a weak spin up tornado out here in the upper plains as well.